April 1944. The harbor breathed like a giant animal, snorting fog and diesel, as a troop transport nosed toward the pier under a sky the color of dented pewter. The women, nurses, teachers, clerks, crowded the rail in a hush that tasted like iodine and fear. Akiko Suzuki, 28, kept her hands tight around the strap of a canvas satchel that had once held bandages and now held a notebook, a comb with 3 teeth missing, and one photograph of her mother.
She had imagined a coastline of hungry buildings, roofs like broken teeth, and men with blunt faces and boots meant to stamp. Instead, cranes that swung with choreographed grace, painted signs in cheerful colors, sirens keening not in panic but in procedure. Somewhere a radio bled jazz into the cold. The pier was orderly. The pier was clean. Inside her skull, the words she had grown up with, decadent America, greedy America, collapsing America, bounced once and slid down into a quiet pocket that felt like shame.
The air smelled of hot metal and oranges. Oranges in the spring. She had not tasted one in 2 years. "Don't wonder," whispered Keiko, a teacher whose voice could fold a classroom of boys into obedience. "It's an act, a stage set." Akiko nodded, because nodding was easier than arguing with the body, which had already begun to trust the neatness of the gangway and the softness of the dock workers. "Easy there, ma'am." She stepped onto American wood and felt it answer with a gentle thump, as if the earth were clearing its throat to speak.
What if the first thing the enemy gives you isn't a blow, but a gentle place to stand? If this opening unsettled your expectations, stay with us, subscribe, and keep listening. The next turn will test every certainty. They were processed in a building with windows so clean the sun came in like a benediction. Paperwork unfurled in English rectangles across a long table, and a woman in a blue cardigan smiled with a tired kindness that made Akiko ache. No one shouted.
The guards, boys really, with freckles in a scuffed posture, said please when they asked for fingerprints and thank you when they took them. When Akiko hesitated at the metal sink, a sergeant with a wedding band and a calm voice showed her how to turn the tap with just the back of a hand. "So you don't contaminate the faucet again," he said. Contaminate. He used her language of hygiene as if it belonged to them both. At noon, they were given sandwiches and apples.
Apples the size of fists, polished like the cheeks of dolls, wrapped not in scarcity, but in paper as white as a hospital sheet. Akiko held hers and felt the weight of it tug not at her arm, but at her convictions. She thought of the lectures in the nursing school assembly hall. America was rotting from within. America gorged and could not share. America treated prisoners with theatrical mercy for cameras while starvation ruled the streets.
Yet here was a sandwich thick with meat and no camera except the eye. On the edge of the room, a radio spoke in a quick, clipped voice about elections, about factories hiring, about a baseball pitcher with a sorrowful curveball. Akiko tried to picture the curve in the air and felt something in her logic curve with it, bending around an object she could not yet name. When a promised monster introduces you to manners, where do you place your fear?
The train groaned to life, heavy and deliberative, as if thinking its way across the rails. From the window, America unspooled like a film reel. Shipyards that clanged and sang, depots stacked with crates, a blur of billboards painted with toothpaste smiles, and refrigerators gleaming with chrome. That last object, a refrigerator in a sign taller than any temple gate she had known, seemed indecent in its promise. A box of cold, always, a promise to the stomach.
Akiko touched her own with an absent hand and remembered the winter of thin rice and bitter tea. Across from her, a clerk in a gray uniform, Yumi, pressed her forehead to the glass and murmured, "Look at the shoes, Akiko-san." She meant the feet at the station platform, men in boots not patched, women in pumps with straps whole, children in scuffed Oxfords that were still shoes and not replicas cut from old tires. A man in a light suit carried a newspaper whose headline declared a new factory opening 3 towns over. In her country, the last factory she had seen was a skeleton ringed with smoke. They passed farms green as new bandages and towns where storefronts spilled bright goods onto sidewalks. In one city, on an avenue bristling with trees, Akiko saw a supermarket through its plate glass front. The aisle long and glowing, labels rank on rank, small soldiers of sugar and soup and soap.
The train was moving, but it felt absurdly as if the store were moving instead, sliding inside her head and rearranging the furniture. What do you do when abundance drifts past your window like a parade you were told did not exist? Want to see what happens when the train stops? Stay with us. Your perspective is about to turn inside out. They slept in bursts, fatigue whittled into splinters by novelty.
At a nighttime whistle stop, a porter with a notebook and a pencil tucked behind his ear said, "You ladies need blankets?" and produced them in a stack that smelled of starch and lavender. Lavender. The scent rebooted a memory of medical school, an instructor's demonstration of dressings infused with floral water to calm trembling patients. "You're no trouble," the porter said when Keiko tried to refuse. "No trouble," Akiko repeated to herself like a bitter joke, except for the war with 1,000 knives. In the dining car, they saw coffee pour black and generous into china cups, pancakes arriving round as moons and just as gentle. The server, a woman with a name tag that read M. Carter, touched her wrist briefly as she set down a plate. "Eat," she said, not unkindly. "You'll feel steadier after." Feeling steady, Akiko thought, was a luxury like song, but she took the fork.
"Do you think this is for show?" Yumi asked, carving small squares from a pancake as if dividing a map. "If it is, the show is well rehearsed," Akiko said. She intended the line to have bite in it. It came out soft. When kindness repeats with the precision of a drill, is it strategy or culture? If that question hums in you, share this with someone who loves history. The next chapter enters the camp and refuses the easy answer.
Crystal City, Texas, arrived at the end of the tracks like a sentence with a long pause. The fences were real. So were the rules and the watchtowers and the inventory of names that marched across clipboards. But the sky was Texas-wide, a blue that made skeptics blink, and the ground wore a jacket of grass. Akiko walked between barracks that had been brushed with fresh paint. Laundry lines looped like musical staff over open space where children, their hair clipped neat, turned cartwheels and fell laughing into the dust. An American guard with a face sunburned into friendliness tipped his cap. "Ma'am," he said. He used the word as if it were a bridge, not a wall. Another guard, older, with a jaw like a carpenter's plane, stopped to point out the infirmary. "We keep it stocked," he said. "If you have nursing training, we could use the help." He had the look of a man who preferred competence to politics. Akiko said she did. He said his name was Sergeant Hale. He extended his hand, and after a heartbeat's debate with the ghost of every rule she had been taught, she shook it. Inside the infirmary, the cabinet smiled with orderly supplies. Gauze, iodine, alcohol, soap, proper gloves. The beds had springs. The windows opened and shut without a fight.
The woman in charge, a civilian nurse named Martha, walked Akiko through the ledger, the routine checks, the vaccinations. "You ran a surgical ward?" Martha asked after Akiko, cautious, recited a history near the truth. "Then you'll find this simple, if you like simple." She showed her where the syringes lived. "We boil them twice," she said. "I don't care what the book says, twice is better." What if the bars of a camp's fence boxed in not malice, but method? If that twist surprises you, click to keep going. Method has consequences, and we're about to count them. The first test came on a hot afternoon when the wind stumbled and fell. A child, German, freckled, stubborn, biked too fast, clipped a stone and tore his knee open. He howled not because of pain but because of the blood itself, amazed. Akiko knelt, motioned him to sit, and felt Martha drop beside her like a well-timed chorus. "You take lead," Martha said. Akiko swabbed. The boy hissed and then stared, fascinated, as the slice of skin stitched itself forward under her hands. "You're good," Martha said. Praise, delivered cleanly, stripped the plea from Akiko's throat before she could stop it. "I was trained to be." At night, the camp slept with the alert stillness of a hospital ward. From the barracks, Akiko could hear the unremarkable symphony of a functioning place. The clink of utensils, the soft exhales of bunks, the squeak of a door hinge that would be oiled by morning. The American staff rotated through shifts with a reliability that moved past habit into ethic. Rules mattered, schedules mattered, people mattered, because the rules were for them. Akiko watched the pattern repeat and found to her surprise that repetition softened fear better than any speech. There were classes. The camp had a school with chalkboards and desks, a canteen with shelves that did not empty, a small library where the thin paper of newspapers whispered as fingers turned pages. The Red Cross visited, took notes, left packages with chocolate inside. Chocolate. It dissolved on the tongue like an argument abandoned mid-sentence. If the daily hum of order becomes a lullaby, what happens to the alarm you were told to keep ringing? The news broke like a dish. Photographs, grainy and implacable, spread across a table in the library. Skeletal men with eyes too old for any calendar. Stacks of shoes that looked like a city's worth of walking stacked into silence. Heaps of hair that turned humanity into an inventory. A headline said camps. Another said liberation. The librarian, a man who shelved magazines with the seriousness of a judge, stood with his hands flexed open as if trying to hold back the page and failing. Martha read, lips moving. "My God," she said, not as a prayer but as an exhale. Akiko touched the edge of a photograph with 2 fingers and felt the paper bite. The word camps slid into place beside the camp she knew, and her mind rejected the equation like a body rejecting a splinter. "Propaganda," Uni said hoarsely. She spoke the word not because she believed it, but because she needed a lever. "Propaganda is usually prettier," Marta said. She set down the paper and swallowed. "This is uglier than truth should be." Akiko walked outside and found Sergeant Hale standing with his hat off. He looked at the sky the way some men look at maps. "We didn't know the scale," he said, as if continuing a conversation he had been having alone. "Some did, but most of us—" He let the rest trail into the dust, and then added, helpless and honest, "I don't have a sentence for this." He did not defend his side. He did not reach for grammar to fix it. He stood in the bleak daylight of fact and let it blind him.
When a word you trusted, camp, shatters into 2 irreconcilable meanings, which one cuts deeper? The shock came not as a single blow, but as a swarm of small stings. It stung in the infirmary when Martha quietly doubled the bandage order for a shipment of European refugees expected in a city far away. It stung in the canteen when Akiko saw a sign asking for donations of coats for those who have nothing left, not even names. It stung in a Sunday bulletin board notice where someone had copied a paragraph from a newspaper describing the liberation. Written in a calm so devastating, it felt like anesthesia wearing off. That night, Akiko took out her notebook and wrote, "We were told the enemy was savage in appetite, not in creation. We were told we were guardians of purity, not collaborators in silence." The pen scraped. The words looked like foreign citizens on her page, polite but unmoored. She remembered a lecture in which a visiting officer had spoken with shiny confidence about the necessity of harsh measures for victory, about camps as efficient sorting houses. She remembered, too, the disgust that sometimes rose in her like bile after a shift in a field hospital where supplies vanished into the pockets of the powerful while the wounded chewed their rage like gristle. In the morning she rose into a world that remains stubbornly ordinary. The sun sat on the fence posts. The guards made their rounds and said good morning as if it still were. Children practiced a play in which frogs learned to read.
A German mother traded recipes with a Japanese grandmother over the fence of a herb garden. In that level light, the contradiction inside Akiko felt sharper. How could this discipline, this civilian decency, be the same America that dropped bombs? How could the same axis of war that embraced her side include men who engineered starvation and called it policy? The map of her beliefs wrinkled like paper in heat. If your heart discovers that monstrousness and mercy can live on neighboring streets, which address do you choose for your conscience? Share this moment if it resonates. The next turn dives into Akiko's private reckonings, where memory meets method. She did what trained minds do. She compared. She compared the steady flow of supplies in the camp to the anemic trickle in hospitals back home, where mentors had nodded grimly at shortages and then asked students to braid obedience with ingenuity. She compared the behavior of guards who held doors for elderly internees to the behavior of officials who had once scolded her for wasting gauze while their own hands were wrapped in silk. She compared the public square of an American bulletin board, messy with opinions, to the tidy rumor of whispers back home where dissent lived in teacups and tremors. The more she compared, the less her old certainties could stand. But the mind does not surrender without ritual.
She tried a litany of explanations. The Americans are performing, yet they perform too consistently. The camp is unusual, yet travelers passing through told the same stories. The kindness is weakness, yet the factories kept blooming on the horizon like stubborn steel flowers, evidence that softness here could wear an iron spine. One afternoon, while inventorying antiseptics, she found Sergeant Hale standing in the doorway with an aquant set to his shoulders.
I can requisition more. She thought of asking for something absurd, a test. Instead, she named practical items, catgut, gentian violet, clean basins, and watched him write without flinch or lecture. He returned a week later with exactly what she had requested, stacked like answered prayer. We said we'd keep the infirmary stocked, he said. We meant it. The sentence fell into her like a stone into deep water and sent rings outward. What if reliability, more than rhetoric, is the chisel that remakes belief?
If you're tracing those ripples with us, don't stop now. We're approaching the moment when Akiko chooses what to do with her fractured mirror. The women developed a strange fraternity under the Texas sun. They were linked less by nationality than by habit. The habit of paying attention, of calibrating expectations against outcomes. Keiko taught English verbs to children in the afternoons, the chalk snupping sometimes with her force. The children fled the tent mumbling, "But why? Is it always an aching teacher?"
Yumi volunteered in the library and learned the names of every magazine as if learning a new set of bones. Akiko worked and listened. When Martha grew quiet, she asked gently, "What do you do with news like that?" "You carry it without lying about the weight," Martha said. "And you don't let it knock the good out of your hands." It was a sentence a nurse could love. A sentence that gave the moral world the same kind of rails the train had followed. A track you could see, steel you could touch. That night, Akiko dreamed of rails crossing at impossible angles and woke with her palms itching as if they had been resting on hot metal.
In the following weeks, American newspapers bled more photographs, more testimonies. The library filled with a new hush, the kind reserved for funerals and births.
Sergeant Hale signed a petition to sponsor a refugee family with his wages and taped the paper to the staff bulletin board without comment. No one turned it into a speech. No one made a theater of their virtue. They simply organized trucks and crates and lists. Order again, bending toward repair. Can quiet logistics be a form of repentance and a more persuasive sermon than any flag? If that sounds plausible, keep listening. The culmination lies ahead, in a single symbolic object that rearranges the room. The symbolic shift began with a radio. In the barracks common room, an American-made set, walnut casement, dials like polished knuckles, sat on a shelf. It was heavy and handsome and unembarrassed by its own craftsmanship. Akiko had come to think of it as benign furniture.
But one evening, a broadcast poured from it that welded together the contradictions in her mind. A report from Europe, a correspondent's voice clipped and trembling as he narrated the liberation of a camp, what had been taken, what had been found, what could not be measured. The radio, an object of comfort, became a messenger of the kind of truth that corrodes illusions and then plates the remaining metal with a harder honesty.
It made America's abundance feel like a responsibility fulfilled rather than a sin of gluttony. It made the camp's kindness feel less like performance and more like policy, shaped by a belief that human beings are ends, not means. It made her own prior certainty feel small. The box with dials had become, in an instant, a reliquary of a civilization's choices. After the broadcast, the room did not applaud. It breathed. A guard turned the volume down. Keiko wiped at her eyes in an impatient gesture that scolded her tears for being unprofessional. Yumi said, in a flat tone that meant she was thinking, "If our side knew, and some did, then our side has to answer for that knowing." The sentence was a bridge to a different shore, and no one rushed to cross it. Akiko looked at her notebook and wrote a single line. Then the word civilization is not owned by uniforms, but by habits. When a radio becomes a mirror, what part of your face do you recognize, and what part have you never seen? If that reflection feels urgent, follow. The next part presses into choice, where memory turns into plan. The decision about the future did not happen with a fanfare. It arrived like the way a fever breaks, slowly, then all at once, with a sudden lightness that felt like exhaustion becoming clarity. The war still raged, the fences still stood. But inside the fence, a different geography had taken root in Akiko. She wanted to return home someday. Home was a gravity that did not relax its pull. Yet she could not imagine returning with her old vocabulary intact. She wanted to bring the ethic of the infirmary with her. The double-boiled syringes, the ledger that matched supplies to needs, the rule that rules exist to serve people, not the reverse. She went to Sergeant Hale with a request. "I want books," she said simply. "Public health, administration, nursing ethics. If I'm sent back, I want to carry a system in my head." He rubbed his jaw and nodded. "We can find those," he said. "You're planning for after." She met his eyes. "Isn't everyone?" He considered. "The decent ones are," he said. The books arrived, thick with diagrams and methods. Martha arranged study hours like a conspirator of goodness. Keiko and Yumi joined, drifting between chapters, arguing definitions at the dinner table with the precision of surgeons.
They quarreled not in bitterness, but in the relief that came from handling tools of repair after a season of damage. The camp, once a word of confinement, had become a laboratory of potential, a paradox that Akiko tucked away to consider later.
What if the most radical rebellion after a war is not vengeance, but competent care? If that claim startles you, stay with the final stretch. The legacy of this shock will outlast the fences.
In July 1945, the heat sat on the world like a thick book closing. News from Europe tallied trials and testimonies. News from the Pacific flickered between hope and horror. The camp's routines held, and their holding became a kind of argument that continuity could be virtue when it kept people fed, clean, and counted. In the infirmary, Akiko supervised a vaccination day that ran like a hymn, minor key to major, a sequence of small stings ending in relief.
Afterward, sitting in the shade outside the barracks, she watched two American soldiers teach a boy chess with a patience that would have seemed foolish on a battlefield. The chessboard glittered like an orderly universe. "Your knight doesn't have to be a hero," one soldier said. "It just has to know how it moves." The line lodged in Akiko's chest. Her old ideology had demanded heroics, a purity so sharp it cut fingers.
Here was a strategy that valued knowing your shape, your capacity, your place in a larger plan that didn't make you the center. When the war finally flung open its last door, the camp began to empty in slow, uneven waves. People left with bundles and babies, and a solemnity that felt like respect paid to something invisible. Akiko stood at the fence one evening with Martha. "Will you stay?" Martha asked softly. "I will go back," Akiko said. "My mother is there.
My language is there. My wrong turns are there." She paused. "But I will carry this," she gestured at the camp that had been both cage and school, "until it wears the shape of where I'm going." Can a person be repatriated to a country and still be loyal to a different set of habits? If that paradox intrigues you, like and share. The closing pages weave memory into witness. On the train heading away, the landscape performed its American recital again. Towns, silos, the shameless supermarkets.
Akiko watched without the panic of earlier. She did not feel seduced, she felt instructed. The abundance she had learned ran on rails of obligation. The technology dazzled, yes, but the quiet muscles of maintenance impressed her more. The schedule that brought milk, the ledger that prevented theft, the policy that insisted on decency as something audited, not wished into being. At a station stop, an old man with a camera asked if he could photograph the women. "To remember," he said. They agreed.
He posed them in front of a mural of fruit the size of planets and laughed apologetically when he realized the irony. "It's a silly background," he said. "No," Akiko answered. "It is the correct background. We will be asked later about the shape of what we saw." She thought of showing the photograph to her mother beside a bowl of rice, of pointing to the tomatoes as if pointing to a theorem. Yumi, fiddling with her ticket, said what none of them had yet voiced plainly. "I believed because it felt clean to believe." Her voice did not ask forgiveness, it filed a report. "Now I know cleanliness is a practice," she added. Akiko smiled, a small, surprised thing. Practice. The word was a bridge made from days. If belief was once a uniform you wore, can practice become the skin you live in?
Years later, after the contradictions crystallized into stories she could tell without swallowing glass, after the new hospital wing she helped design insisted on double boils for instruments and double checks for inventory, after the small clinic she ran stayed lit during typhoon season because she fought for a generator and won, Akiko kept the photograph from the station in a drawer. She did not display it. She consulted it, like a map folded carefully along its creases. When young nurses asked her why she was so strict about schedules, she said, "Because a schedule is a kindness you can taste," and thought of pancakes arriving warm on a moving train. when administrators asked why she resisted orders that came wrapped in ideology rather than evidence, she said, "Because I have seen what happens when a word like camp hides a crime," and thought of the photographs in the library that cut the air into ribbons.
Once, at a conference that smelled of tea and starch, a man with a soft voice and a hard smile said that kindness in wartime was weakness. Akiko did not argue with him in public. She described instead a camp where a guard kept his promises, to an infirmary where a nurse taught a stranger to stitch and then trusted her, where a radio made a whole room difficult but honest.
She described the way the shelves stayed stocked, the way schedules hushed fear, the way decency multiplied when treated as duty. The room listened. The man did not change his smile. But afterward, 3 nurses came to her and asked for a copy of her supply ledger template. If the stories we keep become the systems we build, what stories will you choose?
In the quiet of late evenings, when the hospital's pulse slowed to a steady drum, Akiko sometimes thought of Sergeant Hale and Martha and the porter with the lavender blankets. She thought of Keiko and Yumi, of their chalk and magazines, and how they had all stood in a room while a radio changed shape. She thought of the way her country's shape had changed in her head without ripping the page. The map had new lines now, new rails.
From this distance, the moral and ideological shock of those years did not feel like a wound that would not close. It felt like a graft that had taken, a piece of foreign skin that had learned to live on new flesh, bringing with it a tolerance for truth and a refusal to be satisfied with slogans. Her patriotism, if the word still applied, no longer wore medals. It wore a watch. It measured time in doses and meals and clean incisions. It saluted not flags, but checklists that saved lives. If a new patriotism wears a watch instead of a medal, can it keep better time with the human heart? Years stack. People age into the expressions they practiced when they were young. Akiko aged into a look of intent gentleness, a face that suggested she was always listening to something quieter than speech.
When she died, late, gently, as if stepping off a train onto a familiar platform, her notebook was found in its drawer beside the photograph. The last entry read, "We were wrong about them, and thus about ourselves. We were shown a fence that held us, and the kindness that steadied us. We were shown crimes that demanded we change. We changed. At the funeral, someone read a passage from a nursing manual about asepsis." It sounded, in that room full of grief and flowers, like an essay about ethics. Martha's letter, preserved in a sleeve, was passed hand to hand. In it, the older nurse had written years ago, "Decency must be boring to be trusted." Akiko had underlined the sentence 3 times and drawn a small star in the margin, the only flourish in a book otherwise devoted to lines and lists.
And so the legacy hardened into something supple, a method that could flex for mercy without snapping, a practice that could endure politics without poisoning. The women who had once pressed their faces to a train window and watched abundance scroll by had come to understand that abundance, without a spine, was only spectacle. With a spine, it fed children, stocked cabinets, kept promises, and stood in the light with its faults visible.
If decency must be boring to be trusted, will we choose the boredom that saves us or the drama that burns? In the end, the story of Akiko Suzuki and the women around her lives not because it flatters anyone, but because it refuses to. It illuminates the tricks propaganda plays with our hunger for purity, for a hero's mirror, for an enemy easy to hate.
It shows how a sandwich and a schedule can renegotiate the soul, how a radio can turn from furniture to witness, how a fence can hold a school as well as a prison. It shows, too, the brutal combustion of certainty when photographs of atrocity press themselves against our eyes. The moral and ideological shock here is a two-voiced chord. The kindness that contradicts your enemy's mask, the cruelty that indicts your ally's mask. To live with both is to grow up.
To act on both is to build better rooms for the living. Akiko did not become a saint. Saints are too smooth. She became a caretaker with sharp corners and a trustworthy watch. So remember this as the credits would roll if this were the kind of story that needed them. Somewhere, in a Texas sky hot enough to iron out a page, a woman decided that the future would be measured in kept appointments and clean instruments.
And somewhere else, in a room with a radio, she learned that the truth, when it hurts, does not always ask for your permission before it sets your bones. If truth refuses your permission yet still sets your bones, what will you do with the new posture?